And so I think Deborah crushing the head of this evil commander is a serpent crusher type thing. But again, not the person we're expecting to be a serpent crusher. But we know it's important because we get a song. When you get a song in the Bible, something important's happening. Let's memorialize it. Deborah, and particularly what Jael does, is celebrated, delivering the people through crushing this serpent figure.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew. You are joining one of your hosts, me, Rachel Redeemed, and our fellow host, Matt Sells. Have you got your brew?
Got my brew. Have you got your brew?
I do, yes. I've gone rooibos, red bush. I still don't know how to say it. With chamomile. I feel I needed something soothing as we were getting into a tricky passage today. What have you
I've
got?
broken away. I'm on rooibos.
A
few episodes ago, I flirted with the rooibos. I looked at it in the cupboard, but I've had too much caffeine already this morning, so I grabbed a rooibos. No chamomile, just regular rooibos.
Okay.
But yeah. So we
Close
almost
enough.
matched. We almost matched.
Yeah, I felt I needed it. It touted to me that it was a calm infusion this morning, and I felt I needed that as we step in to one of the darkest passages, I think, of Israel's history. So we are doing the book of Judges. Listener discretion is advised. It is going to get dark. Literally has one of my least favorite Bible stories in it. So we will see how we get on. It's still God's word. It's still good. It is good to look at it. We are doing the whole of Judges in OverBrew style, with the key chapters being 2 to 5 and 13 to 16. But before we get into the meat of what on earth is going on in Judges, it is going to be the story so far. So who's going to be up for it this morning?
Are you up for it, Rachel? You've got the tea at the ready.
I've got the tea.
I feel you're primed to go.
Let's give it a go. Right. We have a good God creating a good garden with his amazing creation of all good things, and it's very good with Adam and Eve. And they're in relationship with him, walking with him in the cool of the day. It's this kind of beautiful, idyllic place, but ultimately it's that relationship between humans and God that is the main thing going on there. We get this crafty snake-like creature, the serpent, coming in, a form of Satan, tempting them and twisting God's words. They listen, they are cast out of the garden as they have sinned, and it's no longer safe for them to be able to reach the tree of life, and something has to be done to mend that relationship. And they go down out of Eden, down. We meet shady characters doing shady things through the rest of Genesis, and we meet Abraham, and there's moments of hope and light as we see the promises. We get that he will be given a land, people, and blessing. This kind of random guy plucked out of obscurity. From him, we then get Isaac and Jacob and sons. So then we have Joseph. And then Joseph, of his Technicolor fame, leads to the Prince of Egypt, of more musical fame, going into Moses' time in Egypt with the big showdown between Pharaoh and Yahweh. So again, Pharaoh, a serpent-like creature. They are down in Egypt and in slavery to this terrible godlike figure. But we see in the most dramatic of fashions, Yahweh win. So we see them be released from slavery, and they are a saved people. They've not just been kind of saved for nothing, but they're saved to worship, and they go out into the crossing of the Red Sea, and it's all very dramatic and exciting. And then we get an understanding of how this unholy bunch of miscreants, who've again been just saved because of God's amazing grace to them, how they're to live with this holy God. And we get kind of the rules for the tabernacle and sacrifices and how it's all going to work. And they end up wandering the wilderness because Numbers is full of grumblers, and it's all a big old mess, and it's sad. And God is desperate in a good way to relate to his people, but they're just not going with it, and they want to do their own thing and do it in their own way. Maybe that's like bringing the wrong kind of fire, trying to get to God on their own terms. We see how they're supposed to come to the Lord with Aaron, the high priest, and how it's all supposed to work. So we get that good picture. At some point, they've been given the Ten Commandments, so they are clearly shown what this kind of relationship looks like with the Lord. And we then keep getting, moments of hope and moments of, oh, they've just misunderstood the character of God and they're going against him. So yeah, we then get to, after the much wandering around in the wilderness, we get to an Eden-like place. Again, crossing another bout of water that the Lord makes them pass through on dry ground. And they get to Jericho, and the whole thing of marching around this ridiculous pantomime of shenanigans, where all the walls fall down, and it's entirely the Lord who does this, and they go into the promised land, and it could be good because they're back
And
in
they
an
all
Eden-like
lived
place.
happily ever after.
Yes.
This has been a great episode in Judges.
Yep.
See you all next week. I love that retelling, so helpful. And as you tell it, it feels like we've got there, doesn't it?
We're going
They've
up the steep
finally,
slope. It's good.
we've gone up there into the land, and
Yep.
oh,
Yeah.
not so much. I mean, I've just been reading Judges again today, but just hearing that story in the background, I mean, that's a really good retelling, and that context just really helps us when we come to Judges. What's going on? Why these stories? To understand, they're sort of back in Eden. They've got this Eden-like land. What will now happen? I think with that in view, I think we're primed to read some, as you said, some of the darkest stories. I think probably in the whole of Scripture. Actually, I don't think it gets worse than some of what we see described here. And I think at the end of the last episode, looking ahead to Judges, I think we possibly said that one of the ways we'll see Christ in Judges is not so much by positive example, but we need a king, we need a deliverer who is not like person X or situation Y. So actually, Judges, in a sense, is the negative, dark background against which the bright light of the gospel will shine. So in a sense, we can come away pretty discouraged about what humanity's like on their own, but hopefully by the negative example, we'll get pointed to Christ in lots of wonderful ways and see how he is so different to all this misery and heartache and wickedness.
Yeah. I've heard a helpful thing when reading the Bible. We do get to see Jesus and we see his face. So he's, shown as the perfect king. We might see his back, and that's just kind of as we follow him, or we see his lack and how much we need him. So his face, his back, his lack. And I think in Judges, it is most certainly the lack. Helpfully, I've seen in the past how you see it as a spiral downwards and downwards and downwards as the people get further away from what they even understand God's character to be like and start attributing terrible things to him. And just knowing that you're going into something where it's just going to get worse is for me assuring, because then it feels like when it is awful, it's meant to be awful, as opposed to thinking, oh, maybe it kind of is going to get better or something. It's to be like, this is what happens when you walk away from the Lord.
I think relating it to God's character, and that's so much of the problem. We can read Judges and just see sin and wickedness, but actually in chapter 2, we see that during the lifetime of Joshua, we saw this at the end of Joshua, during the lifetime of Joshua, during the lifetime of those who remembered all the Lord had done, the people served the Lord. But then, this is chapter 2, verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he'd done for Israel. Then they did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. I guess what you said about the Lord's character, actually they haven't been doing what Deuteronomy said. Tell this story.
Yes.
Tell the story. Tell your children. Tell it when you walk about. We were slaves in Egypt. The Lord rescued us because he's good, because he's a rescuing God, because he wants relationship. That story makes sense of life now. Same for us as Christians. We gather, we remember what Christ has done for us. We share bread and wine to remember his salvation. It's only that's really going to make sense when we look around and think, oh, is God really for me? Can he really be trusted? Actually retelling that story and go, okay, let's just remember who we are, where we've come from. And that's that key moment in Judges when we realize actually they weren't doing that. They weren't passing on what the Lord had done. They weren't remembering his goodness in the past. That forgetting leads to distrust, disobedience, and all the sin that follows.
I'd actually underlined the same little passage and then just scribbled a note saying, "So emotionally awful, stop." They'd abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, the one who'd brought them out of Egypt, that saving name of Yahweh, the one who's rescues them from Egypt. And just to know that they were going to get themselves into not only a mess, but a really big mess because they hadn't listened to the Lord. They'd just done their own thing. They didn't think they needed to carry out what he said with completing the conquest of the land.
And we get the judges, which is God's grace, actually, that these people keep getting into distress. And we get, I don't know if you noticed this kind of cyclical pattern in the notes. There's a little sort of pointer to this, that the people do evil, the Lord gives them over to their enemies, but then they cry out, the Lord raises up a deliverer or judge, depending on how different translations have it, who delivers the people, who rescues them. Then the land has rest. And then the judge dies. And then the people do evil. And the Lord gives them into the hands of their enemies. And we get this cycle that continues. And as you said at the start, but sort of it's not repeating exactly the same. It feels to get worse. The people trust God less and less. The judges actually start off pretty godly figures, certainly Deborah. But by the time you get to Samson, the judges are actually as bad or worse than the people themselves.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty, progressive deterioration. Downward spiral is quite a sort of a summary of the structure of judges. Bad to worse. There we go.
Yes. The thugometer goes up as you read more. And amazingly, God still uses some of these folks, and, a lot of them have interesting quirks, and they are fascinating characters from a storytelling point of view. It's just...
Who grabbed you, Rachel? Because they are... bizarre.
They are, but
quirky people doing quirky things.
We've got Ehud, the left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin. So, seen in that time as kind of a weak clan and a weak person with the left-handed, or kind of maybe not your chosen, the person you might think of. And he's sent to deliver the Israelites from the king of Moab, Eglon. What a great name! And this is 12-year-old boy comic book glee here. Again, before it really gets to the point of awful, we can at least have a giggle. There's this whole toilet humour section. There might not be everyone's cup of tea, but, he goes in and says, "I have a secret message for you." Ooh, tell me more, flatter my ego. I must have the secret message. It clears everyone else away. That's the king. So the attendants leave him, and then Ehud says, "I have a message from God for you." It's so dramatic. And then he pulls out this sword and he plunges it into the belly of this very fat king Eglon, so much so that the blade goes all the way in, the fat closes over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. It's in my translation, folks. So
NIV, his bowels emptied. Yeah.
And I've seen something before of the sword. Now we have the sword of the Spirit. That's the Bible, God's word. It can cut through things. And, what does it reveal? What's inside us? But then you get the story continuing when Ehud goes out and, it may well have been that he escaped through the latrine, out the back. Maybe not. And then everyone else is like, "Where's this guy? Has he had a dodgy mutton vindaloo or something? He's taking a bit of time on the loo. What's going on, folks?"
Yeah.
And then, until they were so embarrassed that they then got a key and opened it up.
Let's be honest, maybe they can smell as well. They go, "Okay, we think he's maybe in the loo." It is incredibly graphic, vivid story, isn't it? It's it's crazy.
Yeah. He's dead on the floor, and then that's that. But then the people of Israel went down with Ehud. The Lord gives them the Moabites into their hands. That is a good day. That means that the land has rest for 80 years. And
rest, an important word. That's a very Eden-like word. And again, I think that Eden thing, this isn't just... We discussed this a little bit in the Joshua episode, so if people want to go back and listen. But this isn't kind of war and violence for the sake of it. This is very much... it's that Genesis 3:15. It's the offspring of the woman versus the offspring of the serpent. This is evil folks attacking God and his people, and God defeating them for the sake of blessing the world through his people, for the sake of the salvation of the world. And so we'll see sort of serpent crushing type moments in the book, particularly in the next story, that with Deborah, but also rest. This is defeat of these enemies meant rest for the people, And so there's a real theology to this, as well as the humorous stories. And I think there's something just about the unlikely deliverers we see when Jesus came, lived, died, rose. That was a very unlikely salvation. Wasn't what the Jews were expecting. Wasn't the sort of thing that Greeks would value. It just that's not how we'd expect salvation to come. And so I think in some of these left-handed deliverers and all these unlikely figures, I think we're getting something of how the Lord works. He doesn't just sort of choose the most obvious way, choose someone who's already got potential. He does things in ways that just baffle the world. And I think some of the humorous stories, if nothing else, teaches that the Lord does his thing. And sometimes we can't get our heads around it, and that's okay. And we should talk about Deborah.
We should.
Another
Help me
unlikely,
out.
Another unlikely figure in a sense. Warriors in those days would have tended to be men. Deborah's the one who's judging Israel. God's people are attacked again. This army commanded by this guy Sisera. They've got 900 chariots of iron. I mean, back then that's like just an army of tanks. That's as good as it gets in the warfare of the day. So they're hugely God's people are hugely under threat. And Deborah calls this guy. This is one where we need my little pink post-it note that I keep in my books of who I was referring to it the other day. Who's who?
Yes, please.
So we've got Deborah who's judging Israel. We've got Sisera who's the evil enemy commander, the enemy, and then we've got Barak who's the guy that Deborah says, "Come on, go out to fight," and he sort of says, "Well, okay, but you come along with me." And we get this little sort of pregnant moment where she says, "Well, okay, I'll come, but you won't get the glory because the glory of today is going to go to a woman." And I hadn't spotted this until just now, but I think we all think it's her.
Yeah.
But there's going to be another woman later in the story. So there's a little kind of, so we think she's saying, "I'm going to get the glory."
Huh.
But actually, we're going to meet another woman. So anyway, Sisera and his army come. They're in this dry river valley. We see later, it seems like the Lord sends floodwaters, sends rain from heaven, sends floodwaters, iron chariots suddenly stuck in the mud. The people are defeated, but, as in the enemies are defeated, but Sisera flees away. This is 4 verse 17 to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. So we get this second woman, Jael. And she says, "Oh, come and sit down, just relax. I'll hide you here." Sisera thinks all is fine, good, I'm safe. She says, "If anyone comes, tell them I'm not here." So Sisera's escaped, his army's been defeated. Sisera the baddie is there in her tent. But then after she's given him this drink of milk, she goes softly to him, takes a tent peg and hammers it through his forehead. I mean, it's
Yikes.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. And actually, the Lord rescues his people through this very unlikely person. She's not even an Israelite. She's a Kenite, whatever they are. But she obviously has heard of the Lord, and she enacts this deliverance. And if we think Genesis 3:15, the offspring of the woman, the serpent will strike the offspring of the woman, but the offspring of the woman will crush his head. And so I think Deborah crushing the head of this evil commander is a serpent crusher type thing. But again, not the person we're expecting to be a serpent crusher.
Yeah.
But we know it's important because we get a song. When you get a song in the Bible, something important's happening. It's a kind of a pause. It's a let's celebrate this moment. Let's memorialize it. And Deborah, and particularly what Jael does, is celebrated, delivering the people through crushing this serpent figure. It finishes again with the land had rest for 40 years. So again, a graphic story, a surprising story, but a picture of God's salvation. And just one more thing, and this is where it gets graphic. Just at the end of the song, the camera turns to Sisera's mother. So 5 verse 28. So Sisera, remember this evil army commander attacking God's people. His army got defeated. He thought he was safe hiding in this tent, but he got killed. His mother, in 5 verse 28, is going, "Why is he so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed? Like, where is he? Why hasn't he come back?" And then she goes, verse 30, "Are they not finding and dividing the spoils, a woman or two for each man?" It's actually, the original there is more graphic than that. It's quite a sexual reference. She thinks he's off pillaging and worse. Just a horrible picture of actually what would happen to captive women in
Wow.
um and I mean, tragically, that is the case with war the world over so often. And even his mother seems to go, "Oh, it's okay. Don't worry. I know why he's late. He's off." I mean, that absolutely appalling, which I think makes then Deborah and Jael as the models of faithfulness, probably in, for Sisera, women are objects. They're just objects to be used. But Deborah and Jael celebrated. Actually, Jael, most blessed of women, 5 verse 24. You don't get that kind of language about many people in Scripture. Mary, the mother of Jesus, being one of the others. So tracing how women are treated and portrayed in Judges is really interesting, both for sadly the horrible negatives. We see this is a sign of a society that has just completely gone wrong when women are treated this way, but also actually the narrative celebrating Deborah and Jael, I think is just quite a nice contrast.
Thank you so much for that. I had not seen that, and had a detail had been missed, but that fills in a bit of the colour of that character and that story. But we move straight into Mr. Gideon, of whom I feel is more of a, if we're going to try and teach the Old Testament in Sunday school, we'll, try and find a good character to kind of have. And Gideon, there's fleeces, we can have a bit of drama with that, and it's a bit more of an easier one. But actually, on reading the whole story, he's not the greatest chap. But again, there's good, there's bad. He is a deliverer. The Lord uses him here. There's lots going on in this story. What are some of the main things we should be keeping an eye out for?
I'd be interested to know what you'd spotted. You said he's not the greatest chap, and I think that's absolutely spot on. What are some of the things that maybe happen that just raise a question mark?
I feel he's a character that you want to really trust the Lord and be the one that you want to be like, yeah, be like Gideon. And actually, you're there just like, oh no, he doesn't trust the Lord, and he does things maybe not quite the right way, and actually the fleece laying out might not be the best of things that he's associated with. What are some of the things that you can steer us to?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He is a deliverer, but he doesn't seem to trust the Lord. There's quite a lot about his fear. He's quite fearful. The angel comes to him and says, come and deliver the people, and this is what will be the sign. He gets given a sign, and then he says, oh right, okay, I might just need one more sign, and then okay, given that, but just maybe I just need one more sign. At some point you think, when an angel is standing in front of you doing miracles, that there might come a point saying, I think I'm just going to trust now. He gets told to pull down the statue of Baal, I think it is, or altar to Baal that his dad's got, but again he's afraid, so he does it at night. There's just these moments that show I'm not sure he's really trusting the Lord. It's interesting, the character sort of progression he goes on. He then, I guess as often happens with quite weak people, he becomes quite self-important later on. So eventually when he leads the people out to war in God's name, he says, we're going to go out and we're going to blow the trumpets and say, for the Lord and for Gibeon and for Gideon. Oh, okay. So for you, the two of you then. Okay, so you are the Lord now. Like that's a, should he be doing that? We don't necessarily see it in our translations as easy, but he names his son Abimelech. And we get a number of Abimelechs in the Bible, because Abimelech means my dad is the king. And so Gideon is sort of refusing to be called the king. He says, no, I shouldn't be the king. The Lord is the king. And then he names his son, my father is the king. So I think so we both get a weakness, but also a bit of a wanting the glory for himself. I think particularly when we've sort of seen Deborah as just a universally positive figure, I think Gideon is much more mixed, leading on through other judges towards Samson.
He is not a great character. I feel, again, he's so known. Well, in the UK we have Lyle's Golden Syrup, which has kind of traditionally been known for kind of out of the strong came for sweetness. I think I've got the quote right. The idea of like a strong man and like, oh yeah, kind of a cool status from that. But actually, he's a thug. But I do like him because of his redemption story at the end. So maybe we can get to that. The story starts with an unsuspecting kind of mother and father that end up with a miraculous conception and an angel coming to tell them about it. And, it's suddenly you're like, wait. This sounds awfully lot like Jesus. What? Yeah. This guy's like, this deliverer, and we've got this whole Nazarite stuff that, if folks who are with us in Deuteronomy, this makes more sense of what on earth a Nazarite is. So again, we have that he's not allowed to have a razor used on his head, and it it must be left long. He's not allowed to have alcohol, and he's not allowed to have contact with the dead. We start off with this kind of, it feels quite bizarre as a starting story. They call him Samson, which is still, I think it means like worshipping the sun god or something. It's not like,
It's a pagan name. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Your son's going to be the deliverer. Call him, like most Hebrew names have to say something about the Lord. The Lord is my king, or something like that. The Lord saves. We're going to call him after like a sun god.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I guess it's demonstrating where we've got to in the story, but take us through some of the life and good and bad of Samson.
There's a phrase that we're going to see at the end of Judges that is sort of the key phrase for the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as they saw fit. I think that's the NIV or ESV and other translations. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And actually, we'll see that phrase a number of times with Samson. Samson in chapter 14 goes down to Timnah, sees a Philistine woman. I think there's kind of Genesis 3 type vibes coming on here. He thinks she's attractive. He says, I want to get her. It's kind of just grasping at the fruit type thing. His father and mother say, wait a minute, you're supposed to be a deliverer of the Lord. The Philistines, that's the enemies. These are the people who've been oppressing us. These are people we're supposed to be delivering from. So getting a wife from there, what are you doing? Faithfulness to the Lord, they say. But he says, no, NIV, she's the right one for me, or ESV, she's right in my eyes. And again, we start to get that I'm going to do what I think best. And that's a real refrain in Judges. That is the problem. People doing what is right in their own eyes. And so a couple of times Samson does what is right in his own eyes. All through chapter 14, we see him concealing what he's doing from his parents, but he didn't tell his mother, but he didn't tell his father, but he didn't, which just, if you start not telling people things you're doing, that's probably a sign, even they are at the shady end. And then what you said about the Nazarite is just so important, because he kills this lion and then he eats the honey from the carcass. I mean, you couldn't get the sort of a more contact with the dead than that. Read the story. He always seems to wind up in a vineyard. Like he's always at a vineyard or a feast. This is a guy who's not supposed to drink alcohol. I think there's only one reason you go to vineyards, or certainly the sort of feast he was going to. Samson shouldn't be drinking. He shouldn't be near the dead, and his hair shouldn't be cut. And he should be. He's the Lord's deliverer. We just see he seems to just flout all of those, and then we get the sort of the famous Samson and Delilah story. Tell me the secret of your strength. Tell me the secret of your strength. And he fobs her off with lies a couple of times, and eventually tells her, cuts the hair off, and he loses strength and is captured. We're sort of getting towards that climax moment when he's captured and taken into the temple of the Philistines.
It's interesting that, it's awful that they put out his eyes, but that it feels that when he cannot physically see, the Lord gives him spiritual sight to know what he's supposed to be doing as a deliverer. And again, it just reads for me that he's been humbled. He's called out of prison. Again, kind of figures of maybe Christ being beaten and people saying, who hit you? That kind of, for people's amusement. And he's made to stand between the pillars. And again, for me, if I'm imagining that, I imagine him with, his arms outstretched, and this weak, blind man who is supposed to be this deliverer. His hair has grown, the Spirit comes upon him, and in that moment, he delivers the Israelites, arms outstretched. He dies in the process in, again, a Christ-like shadow. Again, very much shadow. This guy has been a thug all of his life. Yeah. He didn't live, the life that Jesus lived. To have enacted that for Israel to essentially, carry out that deliverance for the people. And that little note, it says verse 30, that he killed more in his death than in his life, in that sense of like, actually he kind of did what he was supposed to do in delivering Israel. Well, he did actually achieve it in his death right at the end. And maybe that's a reminder that wherever and whatever we've done, we can't, it's not too late to turn to the Lord. It's not too late to come back to him, to accept his love and grace and forgiveness and want to walk his way. Samson took having his eyes put out and being bound and being thrown in prison. Maybe we don't need all that before we realise that actually maybe we should be living the Lord's way.
Yeah, that's so helpful, isn't it? And I just reminded how with Samson, I think when we're looking for Christ in the Old Testament, we want to see how the Old Testament points to Christ rather than a sort of where's Wally, which character is Jesus? Because we read Judges and we can't say, oh, well, Samson is Jesus in this story, because 99% of the time he's clearly not. He's the precise opposite. Other figures like David and Solomon, who in many ways will point to Jesus, but then some moments absolutely not. And just realizing we have to have a more nuanced approach, and so Samson can both be a model of evil, but actually, particularly, you can see something of a journey. I think that just helps us, read sensitively, and just trying to look for, clues in the text of what we're supposed to see here. It feels that that's the end of the well-known stories, but actually, you read on, and this is where it just gets as dark as it gets. I think Judges 19 is probably the worst chapter in the Bible in terms of what is described. This horrific picture we've seen in sort of chapters 17 and 18. There's been this religious corruption, people setting up their own priests, and just religious people doing what they want. And I think that leads to then moral corruption. I think that the moral corruption in chapter 19 comes after the previous chapters. If people aren't worshipping the Lord as they're supposed to, look what happens. And you get this really horrible story about a Levite, his concubine, his kind of, I guess, slave wife or servant wife is the kind of, even having a concubine is pretty grim. But come to this city, there's nowhere for them to stay, so they're going to stay in the square. And then this old guy says, no, don't stay in the square. This is just near Jerusalem, by the way, before, of course, it's become Jerusalem of God's people. This man brings them into the house. This is chapter 19, verse 22. But then wicked men from the city said, bring out the man so we can have sex with him. We get this astonishingly horrible response that the owner says, no, that's an awful thing to want. Have my daughter and the concubine instead. Yeah, this woman's abused and left dead. I mean, it is as horrible as it gets. We might hear echoes of Genesis chapter 19, Sodom, which was proverbial for its wickedness. And so we've got Israel, God's people, who are supposed to be a light to the nations, actually are now worse than the very nations that they were supposed to take God's message to. And then actually 2 chapters, then kind of civil war that follows as a result. And the last line of the book, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. I think for all of Judges, that's the line that just sits over all of it. People did what they wanted. And the book of Judges is almost the Lord just allowing that for a while. And us seeing that just the horror of how women are treated, how weak people are treated, just everything the exact opposite of how it should be. And actually that's where it sets up the book of Samuel. It sets up the king who's to come. But also I just think even before we get there, I think we're going to see how in all these horrible examples of self-serving people and women being mistreated and abused, in Jesus we just see the opposite. We get to such a grim place, but I think that's where we can land and just think, okay, in the kingdom of Christ, how are women treated? In the kingdom of Christ, how are vulnerable people treated? And actually we get that gospel glimpse by contrast.
I mean, that leads directly really to my Monday morning moment. That phrase that's been coming back, people doing what was right in their own eyes. Having done this in a big chunk and having seen that downward spiral down and down and down to this awful place, we're seeing this over dozens, hundreds of years maybe.
Yeah.
And that in my day-to-day, it's easy to just do what's right in my own eyes because I don't see the consequences lived out over 10, 20, 30 years. And so I guess just a hearty moment of sober reflection to question it. What are the things that I'm doing that I think are right in my own eyes? It's not on this scale, but there's small ways that I think that God's way isn't as good for me, or that he doesn't really know best in all the areas of my life. And so just a moment for me to reflect on what are the things that I'm going to think God doesn't really know the best for me in this? And actually, just to be hot on the he does. He's good, and we've seen again with the story so far. We get to see how good he is, and that's for me has made Judges all the worse because you're like, why are you going away from this lovely, amazing, generous, patient, slow to anger God who's rescued these folks out of Egypt? He's done all this amazing, amazing stuff. What character am I attributing to him? Am I giving him these Pharaoh-like characteristics? Am I viewing him as Yahweh, the God who rescues and saves? And do I believe that his ways are good? How about for yourself?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'd want to echo all of that. I think the only thing to add is something I've only just noticed, actually reading in a big chunk, is how, as Judges starts, it looks like the biggest problem is the enemies out there. And we get all the judges to deliver people from the Philistines and other enemies who are pressing them. By the time the book ends, it's clear that actually the biggest problem is not so much energies out there, but the people's own hearts.
Oh, wow.
So that's both, I guess, therefore, following your point, just a reminder to me, just when, actually, me just doing my own thing, going my own way is not a small thing. That's actually far more dangerous than all the hard circumstances. But also it sets up Jesus all the more, who doesn't just defeat enemies out there, but actually does do a work in our hearts. That's what the people need. It doesn't say in those days there was no king in Israel, so the people got bashed by enemies the whole time. The problem for no king is they did what was right in their own eyes. We need a king who will actually lead us in paths of righteousness, as the psalm puts it. And so, it both sort of a challenge and rebuke to me as I am tempted to go my own way, but also just a wonderful pointer to Christ, who does lead our wayward hearts back to him.
Ooh. Well, we have done the darkest chapters, but we will be back with our next episode in 1 Samuel. So if you have been maybe following a traditional Bible, it might go on to Ruth, but we're going to save that. So we are going to go straight into 1 Samuel, and the key chapters are going to be 1 to 3 and 16 and 17. As ever, the BibleOverBrew.com will have some notes and questions and things to help you, with great appreciation for the folks at Good News Broadcasting Association who have made this recording possible. Whew, I feel, we've made it through. Well done, folks. Here we are. Until next time, thank you for listening. Take care. God bless. Bye.
Bye.